الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so at least half the people didn't have lunch, I guess, but I hope still some energy is still there. So my name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am Director of Research at the International Institute of Islamic Thought, the IIIT, which is the organizer of this panel. We already had 2 panels earlier today, and this is our 3rd and final panel. I'll just say a couple of things about IIIT for those of you who do not know much about us. And then I would also like to ask you to excuse if I'm incoherent. It's not because I'm a philosopher, but because I was on a red-eye flight last night, so I'm a little bit bugging out, as they say, not in my element. But the IIIT is an educational academic institution dedicated to the revival of Islamic thought and reform of Muslim societies. It has been around for 35 years. We are a research institute and a publication house. We've published more than 750 books in the last 35 years. Many books we publish in English and Arabic primarily, and then many of our books get translated to many other languages. You can see a sample of those books in the back of this room. And then if you want to know more and to learn more about what we publish and see all of the books that we have, at least all the books that we brought to this convention, you go to booths number 312 and 314 in the bazaar area. And you can also purchase our books, and I don't want to say at a discount, but I guess you will be able to purchase them at least. Also important to know that our books are available on Kindle and Google Play as well, and those are cheaper than the physical copies. But so you can choose which of the 3 you want to buy, or if you just want to stock up on the books while we are here, that's also fine. So with that being said, let me just say a couple of things about this panel. We have 3 very distinguished panelists here with us today: Dr. Aasim Padela, Sheikh Jihad Brown, and Sheikh Bilal Ali Ansari, who are going to talk about a topic that is actually of an utmost relevance, I think, for the Muslims in modern times, and that is the issue of Islamic scholarship and science. You know, in modern times, with the advancement of the scientific revolution and so on, and of course the panelists are going to talk more about that, there's been a lot of debates and questions about the compatibility between religion and science. And this is not something new, actually, for Islamic scholarship. Muslim scholars have been talking about that, you know, from the very beginning. And we know that in the Quran, there are many indications about the importance of the natural world, and of course, clear signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who created the universe and revealed the book, but also established the laws of the universe. And if it's the same creator, then there should be no contradiction between what he reveals in the revealed book, Al-Wahid, the Quran, as well as what he created in the world out there. And actually one of the main methodologies that the IIIT applies was a methodology that was employed by one of the founders of the IIIT, Sheikh who passed away about 2 months ago, is the methodology of Qira'atul Kitabayn, the reading of the 2 books. One book being the revealed book, the Quran, the other book is the universe in front of us. And these are both books of science. And the same creator who revealed one book created the other one. And they should match. There should be no contradiction there. But how to do that, and how to interpret that, and how to make that convincing in contemporary Islamic thought, and how to bring that traditional scholarship to 21st century is something that our panelists are going to talk about. And just one last thing, and that is, we should, when we're talking about these things, avoid projecting. I think, on the one hand, look at the traditional scholarship and say that it portended everything that came after that. But we should also avoid looking at modern science and say that it abrogated everything that classical, traditional Islamic scholarship told us about. So we are sort of between negation of the tradition on the one hand, which is something that we as Muslims can never accept, and also at the same time this kind of the Ijaz al-Ilmi approach, which sometimes goes into very kind of banal interpretation of the Quran. And I think we need to do better than that. So with that being said, I would like first to invite Sheikh Jihad Brown to speak. I would give every speaker maximum 20 minutes because the whole panel is 75. So if each of them speaks for about 20, we're going to have about 15 minutes for the Q&A. So thank you very much for being with us here today. And Sheikh Jihad, your turn.
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika an adilla aw udalla aw azilla aw uzalla aw ajhala aw yujhala alayya. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So our topic, Mind the Gap, bringing Islamic scholars and scientists together to address challenges at the intersection of theology, science, and bioethics. I called my contribution Border Crossings, or recognizing the challenges that face knowledge migrants and information tourists. So we'll set the scene. Baltimore, 2016, the first days of summer. The future of the political process is unclear, and how it will impact our immediate experience of society is uncertain. Everyone's fear of the unknown is causing tensions. New racisms are competing with old racisms. The us against them scenario is easy but not likely promising. The world we live in knows it is lacking ethical clarity, and they know that they don't know where to find it. Life does have meaning, survival of the economically fittest, might makes right, violence pays, caring can get you killed, and the bottom line is king. Aggressive advantage and the exploitation of opportunity is a language of its own, the language of compassion, empathy, wisdom, and ihsan is a foreign tongue, where we define ihsan as the confluence of altruism, quality artisanry, elegant poise, intelligent deference, reverence, and spiritual mindfulness. It is a language only spoken by the brave. Ihsan is a language that is only spoken by the brave. Impetuousness, irreverence, and opportunism are the patois, or the vernacular, of the weak and the frightened. There's a cry for help. Films like The Purge, or an older one that some people may not know, Battle Royale, which was a Japanese novel that was the precursor to the Hunger Games series, or a new television show that's coming out based on an Australian movie, Animal Kingdom. These are a cry for help. Phenomena like gangster rap and pop cultural expressions like inking and body piercing, or even cyber vigilantes like Anonymous. These are all expressions of where people are at right now in our world, and if you think that that is not part of your world, this is very much and very rapidly becoming part of your culture and your communities here in the United States, and even faster in the countries where many of our population here in North America came from. These are expressions of where people are at. People are trying to put on their game face in a world with no options. So who's going to give them these options? So there could be an alternative context. Right? Religion is not about divorcing the dunya. That was an Enlightenment debate that took place in Europe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls our attention to the value of the dunya. Travel in the earth and look how He gave inception to the world, ex nihilo, from nothing. Reflect. And when we look in that world, we find both wonder, which brings about awe, and a poverty that's based on the contingency and sheer need of the world itself, in the awe of the universe, in the wonder of the systems within every human being, and in the sheer and need of all objects for help, and fundamentally for a cause, we find truth. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. We will show them our signs on the horizons and in their very selves until they realize that it is the truth. Our purpose is certain and as much joltingly reifying as it is comforting. وَأَنَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ الْمُنْتَهَى. And to your Lord is your final destination. Along the way, we acknowledge that this metaphysical regime insists on an ethical imperative. مَنْ فَرَّجَ عَنْ أَخِيهِ كَرْبَةً مِنْ كُرَبِ الدُّنْيَا. Whoever will relieve a difficulty of his brother in this life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will relieve a difficulty from him in the hereafter. Allahumma ja'alna minhum. Imam al-Bayhaqi also says about this social or ethical imperative, he narrates, اتَّقُوا دَعْوَةَ الْمَظْلُومِ وَإِنْ كَانَ كَافِرًا. Fear the prayer of the oppressed. And this is something that the ideological, political Islamists will not like to mention, even if a kafir. Fear the prayer of the oppressed, even if a kafir, in some narrations. All of mankind are the dependents of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the most beloved to you, of you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are the most beneficial to His dependents. And if that hadith is found to have some thinness or weakness in its chain, it's borne out by so many other narrations, because when we read Islam, when we read the tradition, we're not doing a cut and paste job of putting one hadith to one case and analyzing it there. We have to read all of the tradition in one moment. What we want to do, all of these ideas are just dreams, and they're words that are khafif in the mizan, that are light in the scale, if they're not backed up by substance. So where do we come with this ability to provide an alternative scenario, an alternative context to a society that is looking for someone to do that? And where do we find that substance? And my job here today is to take the view from 30,000 feet and give some context to the work that has been going on for the past 3 years in drilling down. And this view from 30,000 feet is called situational awareness. It's where precision action begins and theory enables application. Because without it, action is never precise. It is rather called recklessness. Nor could it ever be termed applied, because it's applying what? Right? It's not practical, it becomes impractical. So we have 4 rubrics that I want to touch on very quickly and briefly before I hand over to my colleagues. The first is the issue of identity decisions. The second is paradigm navigation. The third, science updates. And the fourth is holistic civilization. The first rubric about the identity decisions that Muslims in North America must take. They have to decide between an effective identity or a thin, sentimental identity. Of course, the UK in the 90s went through something they called identity analysis of identity politics, and we could probably talk about that in some other session. But a sentimental idea is static. It is a diversion. It comes from the annals of history. It's motionless, ineffectual. It's effectively a boondoggle, as they would say. It's about what once was, and it is like a security blanket. You all remember Linus from the Peanuts, and he had his blanket always with him. You get afraid, or you have a kid that has a blanket or that teddy bear that they can't do without. But we outgrow our security blankets, okay? But sometimes people's identity is just that, it's ineffectual. And there are people who never outgrow their security blankets, like rebel flags and these types of things, right? They have, the grocery store is not called Pathmark or whatever we have down here. I forget, I used to live, I think Kroger is in this area. Down there it's called Winn-Dixie. My kids said, don't they know Dixie lost, right? And this is a security blanket. But look, some of us never outgrow our security blankets. The security blanket identity warrants respect, but not accommodation. Colors, ethnicities, different types of foods at your food bazaar, Italian food and Vietnamese food and different types of fusion things. These things have already been accommodated. So no new simplistic or sentimental identity warrants accommodation. Respect at best. However, an effective identity is kinetic. It implies a worldview. It insists on accommodation. It seeks to shape a shared present and cooperate in building a future. An effective identity does not suffice itself with dreams of becoming. It joins being to becoming in an Islamic worldview. An effective identity is competitive. It meets standards and operates according to standards. A Muslim's conception of self-identity should be able to offer something rich, unique, and substantive to the conversations and projects that play out in our society or are at play in our society. However, a simplistic or naive grasp of Islamic thaqafa or knowledge literacy on our part means that that what we have to offer is also simplistic. Like, for example, what Islam has to say about the environment, right? Ibad al-Rahman yamshuna ala al-ardi hauna, they tread gently on the earth, walhamdulillah. So Islam is effectively saying, don't litter. All right, Captain Obvious, right? Everybody knows don't litter. You haven't contributed anything authentic or unique to an already existing conversation. We know don't litter. So this sentimental or simplistic approach to knowledge, it sells our heritage and our identity short. It sells Islam short, but more practically, it is insignificant and doesn't add value to anyone. However, the Muslim intellectual enterprise, as encountered in its most advanced sources, is very rich, very sophisticated. These disciplines provide instruments and insights that want to explore the compelling bridge between understanding human suffering and personal hopes and the challenges of shaping fair and functional social and institutional policy structures. Many of us are aware that we have a very sophisticated system in Islam about dealing with public good, or masalih al-mursala. Okay? But in one of the primary texts of Maqasid al-Sharia, or Masalih al-Mursala of Sultan al-Ulama al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, he brings our attention to a nuance that we may have missed earlier. And this is a sensitivity of Islamic teachings to psychological well-being. He defines a maslahah, or a good, as, of course, pleasure and what leads to it. Okay? Or happiness and what leads to it. And a mafsada, or a harm, as pain and what causes it. Or gham, anxiety and what causes it. These nuances are there and they echo if we would listen. We might understand is that as we reach out to draw on the sources of our deen to have an authentic contribution to the conversations we engage in with our neighbors, that a system has been produced and created that accounts for these ideas. And when we lose these underlying ideas, our representation of the system is robotic at best. If we listen and allow ourselves to discover the civilizational depths of our own identity, we will find ways of authentically contributing to the social and intellectual fabric of America. We will add unique value. We will realize our identity and become an indispensable part of our world. The second rubric of our 4 rubrics, So that's the count up, right? So I've only been speaking for 6 minutes. That's good. You giving me the mafhum al-mukhalafa? Right, okay. Paradigm navigation. Understanding when we move out of the space of one discipline and we cross over the border into another room that is the purview of a different discipline and has its own language. Being able to navigate these spaces deftly allows each of these disciplines to be effective in its contribution. So let's assume that Muslim participation in theorizing about science has two objectives. The first is to discover entry points for an Islamic contribution to scientific programs. And the second is to really break down and analyze the challenges to faith that we think are there from what might be considered scientific arguments. Now, to do this effectively requires a distinctive awareness of the key principles of any particular disciplinary field and how it makes itself distinct operationally and theoretically from another field. When a conversation or inquiry moves from one space like policy development into another space like mental health diagnosis, we need to be aware of the particular set of specialist skills that are required to speak authoritatively on this new angle of the topic that we're investigating. And equally, we should be cognizant of the correct methodology or system that is appropriately applied to the subject under discussion. For example, the skill set required for minimally invasive surgery in sports medicine is very different than the skill set required for the production of the instruments used in that surgery. And those skills are not transferable from one of those fields into the other. The respiratory system and how it functions is very different than the regime employed for the development of computer chips. You wouldn't apply the same methods and skills to the other. The nervous system does not operate in the same way as the field of insurance adjustments or supply chain management. Being a civil engineer does not position one to identify an effective regime of medical treatments for a patient that requires heart bypass surgery. But then again, does it? Because I have some ideas about how that could be done. Right? See if I could get someone to give me a microphone to talk about it. Or how to design a school in a layout conducive to educational and behavioral development, for that matter. I'll tell you, the academic field of theology relies on the skills of metaphysics, ontology, and logic, whereas the faculty of history uses manuscript analysis and philology, or textual forensics, comparative dating, public and private records, or document comparisons. So we'll keep moving quickly because we have, we'll call it 10 minutes left. Paradigm navigation. When it comes to fields in the physical sciences, there is a fundamental difference between, for example, neurology and neurosurgery on one hand and philosophy of science, of that science on the other hand. So in our scientific laboratory work, there are outcomes that we may document, or that we will be documenting, that will give us the ability to predict the outcome between the encounter of different causes and effects. But what this data that we bring together in the laboratory, what it means to the universe, what it means to a greater reality, that is not handled at the level of applied laboratory science, that's handled at the philosophy of that science. And there's a field called philosophy of science, but the skill set to be a specialist in philosophy of science is taught in the philosophy department. It's not taught in life sciences or the physics department or something like that. And you will have people who are trained in physics, trained in the life sciences, who will actually go into a degree in the philosophy department, and they will move into the theoretical area. But what we have to observe as Muslims looking at these debates that are going on, we have to understand that not every applied science is scientist is particularly very good at the philosophy or the theory of the field that his applied science is in, or her applied science is in. We have to take that into account when we're considering the arguments that are going on. The legacy of Islamic medicine and astronomy and mathematics has shaped the developments of these very same fields in the European West, historically in the past. But so too did Islamic law, and even Kalam theology and logic and linguistic analysis. Okay? So, Islamic theology actually shaped the framework of pre-Protestant Revolution Christian theology, Catholic theology, up until Vatican II officially, 1964 or so. Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, and others. Even some people to this day, like philosophers like Charles Taylor, you'll find that they're grounding their ideas about ultimate reality in systems that reach back to an influence from Muslim Spain. Okay? In London, you will find that every barrister must belong to one of 4 inns of law. What are they? Inner Temple, Outer Temple, Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn. These 4 inns of law were established by crusaders coming back from the Middle East. Where they got the idea of 4, it could just be a coincidence, right? The point is, right, I think it's John Maqdisi, the son of George Maqdisi, for a period was doing conferences I know that he had some conferences in Germany where he saw the influence of Islamic law and legal theory on the development of British common law. The point is this, is not to say, as our moderator mentioned, that Islamic tradition predicted all of these things and therefore we don't need them. No, that would be foolish. Right? But the point is that we haven't been that far off. That there is some substance of things that we can use there to gain some unique and patently native and authentic and Islamic insights into what we're looking at when we're having these conversations. So I'm almost out of time. It says I have 5 minutes left right there. Right, so I'll close with this. I have another thing that we have to be aware of when we're looking to sort out these questions. And there's a number of other things, but my colleagues will cover them, inshallah. Right? There are so many voices and narratives that are competing to speak in the name of Islam or occupy decision-making status for the community. And there are 3 perspective areas that impact on this idea of narrative policy control. We have to understand the different dynamics that are jostling with one another when we're trying to sort out these issues or have conversations or even support conversations about these issues. So these 4 perspectives from which we could analyze the situation of narrative control. The first is motive, meaning intentions, incentives, and drivers. People want to be involved in narrative control of the Muslim community or speak in the name of Islam. The second is ideology. What version of Islam do you follow? The third is declared objectives. What are the ends, either consciously or subconsciously, that you are looking to achieve through your involvement, right, in speaking in the name of Islam? 4 is aptitude or skill set, can you deliver? And 5 is capacity, assets and resources. We're currently in a phase with the community in North America where those who control the assets and resources control the narrative. Right? That's the situation. We have to ask ourselves, how effective will the narrative ever be, right, when that is the situation? But what we want to look at here, more importantly, are what are the objectives that we want to achieve? Right? What are we trying to do for this? Are we trying to keep my family safe? Keep my kids on the straight and narrow? Are we trying to bring the mission of Muhammad to a people who have not yet received it? Or am I trying to, through my work, trying to help people to understand that Islam is a value add to your community and not a danger? All of these are very, very valid objectives. When we're clear about objectives, the tactics will start to possibly make sense. But when we're unclear and our objectives are operating in the subconscious, our tactics oftentimes don't make any sense or we're at cross purposes. Right, I went to one community and one of the members of the board said they had a very ambitious building project. the chairman of the board said once that, he said, I want to make this place like Vatican City. Right? Another member of the board, old Syrian doctor, he said to me, he said, effectively what we're trying to do here is keep our kids from fornicating. Right? Well, I mean, that's good, that's important, right? Hopefully we can achieve that, right, with tawfiq from Allah. But hopefully our objectives could be a little bit more far-sighted and therefore inclusive of all of these smaller things. But understanding the context in which we're trying to have these conversations, not selling out our own resources, because that's what allows us to make an authentic and effective contribution. Barakallahu feekum. This is what's important and at the very bottom of everything. Ahsan Allahu ilaykum.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Aasim from the University of Chicago. I just want to mention, for those of you who joined a little bit later, is that the organizer of the panel is the International Institute of Islamic Thought. We have our publications, some of our publications available in the back, and the rest of our publications are available in Bazaar at our booth at 312 and 314. And incidentally, when Sheikh Jihad talked about Muslim contribution to science in history, we actually have two books, two publications by IIIT on that topic. And if you want to learn more about that, the brother who's standing over there in the corner, Brother Ubay, can point you to the right books. Did you just talk about that?
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulullah. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما انك على كل شيء قدير. So alhamdulillah, inshallah, I'm going to try to move from philosophy of theology, theory, to a little bit of a practical focus for a moment, if you indulge me. Sheikh Jihad has been part of our working group I'm going to describe to you, but I think, and I am a physician, I'm a scientist, so I think our goal for the panel is to talk to you about how we can incorporate this dialogue between theoreticians and applied scientists, and he's pointed to some of the tensions that occur. So I'm going to start with asking you all sort of a couple of questions, and then deconstruct what's going on here. So this is, this conference, the theme is about the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وترى الشمس إذا طلعت تزاور عن كهف ذات اليمين وإذا غربت تقرض ذات الشمال والفجر من. This is from Surah Al-Kahf, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, and you see the translation there, that when you were to see them, you see that the sun rise, when it is rising, is inclining towards the right, from on top of the cave from the right, and when it's declining, it's declining from the left. So my question for you all is what direction is the cave's mouth facing? What direction is the cave's mouth facing? You said north? So the cave is facing north. The mouth is facing north. So then you see the sun rising on the right and the left. Okay. We're sure about that?
It's the south. South.
How's the south?
If the sun rises in the right and it moves and sets in the west, then most of the day it's in the south. So of the group here, who believes that the mouth of the cave is towards the south? Raise your hand. Okay, and those who believe that the cave's mouth is towards the north, raise your hand. Okay, all right. So, and the rest of you, it's too difficult. I'm serious, but we're not going to go on. I need to deconstruct what we're talking about. So seriously, those who believe that the cave's mouth is towards the north, raise your hand. Because you would believe that on the right, if the sun rises from the right, we believe the sun rises from the east, that the opening has to be towards the north. But what if we were to say the cave faces the south? What would you do? You have many options. You could say that the Quran, the perspective of the Quran might be metaphorical. Right? You could say that actually what was happening in 309 years when the people were in the cave was that a miracle was happening for those 309 years where the sun rises from the west. Right? You would have to resolve a tension. And the people here, when you're thinking about how we answer this question, you automatically, what happened was, well, I'm thinking about what I know about the world. How do I view the sun rising, what I've seen in my life, right? But when you're facing a text, or you're facing something else, you have to decide, what am I more certain about? The Quran's verse, and then I'm going to try to explain the way I interpret it, or my own view of what has happened, what I've seen every day for the rest of my life, 38, 50, 50, whatever years I've lived. You're deciding upon what you're more certain about. And you use that to analyze what's occurring with our religion. Let me give you another, this is hadith, right? So wahi, as Dr. Min said, wahi, matlu, ghayr matlu, if you construct, this is wahi, right? So certain, Sayyid Bakhadi, if you want to go that way. But Rasulullah says, وَصَلُّوا كَمَا رَأَيْتُمُونِي أُصَلِّي. So pray as if you're seeing me, as if you saw me pray, like how I pray. We believe this, right? So now, as we all have prayed, we just went to prayer. There are hadith, Ibn Mas'ud and others talk about, very hadith, talk about different ways of Prophet pray. And they're all graded sahih, right? And chains of narration. So how do we, as individuals, looking at a religious text, then decide, did Rasulullah pray with his hands at his side? Did he pray with his hands across his chest? What do we do when we have two narrations that are of similar grade? Do we take one or the other? What do we do? Go ahead.
Depending on the situation, how we do.
So you're saying what?
In the context.
What context?
That particular that might be one time is possible, we leave it another time.
So what you try to do is resolve the tension by coming up with a way that you can accommodate both.
Yes.
But you have not seen Rasulullah pray.
No.
Okay. And both narrations, those individuals saw him pray.
Yes.
Right? So
But
either
that,
are
that does not mean that there is, I mean, the person has to make a decision that there might be the way he did it both ways, so both may be possible.
My point isn't, we're not trying to resolve, I'm saying you're trying to use knowledge of how to resolve a tension that occurs when you believe that both are certain. Both narrations are certain, right?
Yes, but the certainty in the context of one person only is here.
Yeah. So you have to make some analysis.
Yes.
My point here was in both cases, when we're looking at the Quran and the Hadith, we're trying to decide. One was, how does the sun move? How do we know from our own knowledge? The other is, well, we have two certain sources of knowledge. We have to figure out a way to resolve some tension. But we're making an assumption that we can understand what is certainty and what is doubt. We're making some weighing of evidences. So what comes now is kind of the practical aspect of that in working with bioethics, particularly. We have to understand how do we learn knowledge, and what certainty do we attach to our observations. And this has ramifications that are very, very wide and deep. Because then you have this idea, yeah, Quran, we hear this all the time. The Quran tells us, right? The Quran calls upon us to reflect. Yet we have to come to the Quran and other sources with some theory of knowledge, some understanding of how we weigh and balance evidences from the Sunnah and the Quran, and how we weigh and balance evidences from empirical observations and logical deductions or inductions. Because that has ramifications on whether you believe there are miracles or not. Right? I said because one way to resolve the tension about that verse would be that we say that a miracle occurred for 390 years. That the sun rises in a different way because it opens to the south. Right? We have to resolve how we believe what Musa did with his staff. And there are, in our tradition, there are individuals on different spectrums of how we resolve miracles, based on some understanding of what occurs in the Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have ideas, as Sheikh Jihad talked about, how we deal with what is right and good in this life. Right? So panel before they were talking about rape or something, and they said, is rape wrong? You decide, well, I can decide as a community the rape is wrong, right? I can decide as a community, but then when do I know when do I decide things such as other things may or not be right or wrong? Is it on the basis of a community, or is it based on scripture? And then how can we discern what is more certain? Right? When can there be lying be okay? When we talk about the applied fifth sense. So we have to weigh evidences. So here's, I'm not going to talk about my program at the University of Chicago. We do this thing on National Islamic Medicine. The only point here for this slide is that we want to use data and look at how Islamic scholars deal with science so that we can now move beyond a very, as Sheikh has, a static view of the world. And here's the case in Islamic bioethics, very in a brief manner. So the narrative today is that you have all these individuals, right, all these stakeholders talking, but not talking to one another. You have physicians who talk about medicine and science, right, and they talk to the community, so they give advice to patients. You have imams who talk to patients about issues. It might be about abortion and life care, organ transplantation. You had here in this conference some Islamic Baptist panel yesterday, I believe, right? But the physicians are often not connected to the academy. They're not connected to the philosophy of what their medicine is about. And you have local imams who are not connected to the seminary, where they decide and think about how to update our own tradition and what are the various sciences of our tradition. They might have one reading, right? So in our present era, I'll just say my bad. So we have a lot of people come, alims, right? They come, okay, alhamdulillah,
but they have gotten a level of knowledge. The idea of an alim is then you have a certificate to study and research and go further. But because of our present needs, we put them in situations where they have to talk about 1,000 things and we become disconnected from their sources of knowledge and their teachers. So our hope is that we have a dialogue, because that dialogue and bringing people together can lead to more carefully calibrated fiqh, right? And our needs will not just be, as Sheikh Jihad says, we don't just address things with band-aid solutions, but rather we have solutions that can offer something to the greater society. So here we go. Let's talk about physicians and what they know, right? So just to deconstruct. So Muslim physicians are siloed. This is a survey that we did at the Nation of Islamic Medicine with Imana doctors in the United States, and we wanted to ask them how often they engage with Islamic ethical legal scholarship, because we know the community relies upon them for ethical legal guidance often. And you see these are the numbers. Because of lack of time, I'll go through it. But when you talk about, do they read Islamic and Bioethics books? Do they consult jurists, right? Do they assist imams? Have they any reading of the Islamic medical fiqh academies? You see less than half do any of this. Right? And only 2 of our sample here had any degrees in Islamic law, so it's not like they all knew everything, they did not go and read and study. When you then look at the discourse that they produce, this is a friend of mine did this literature review, this is what you find. Over 55 years of writings on Islamic bioethics in the medical literature, you find 146 papers, of which only 11 talk about anything other than a universal Islamic position. So Islam says organ donation is mubah, khalas. Brain death is acceptable. Right? And within that, only 5 of those papers talk anything about the sources of Islamic law or knowledge. What is the implication? The implication is that Muslims, as I said, they present an elementary caricature of our tradition, right? A univocal, which is not a univocal tradition, but a univocal reading. And when they speak to others outside, right, patients and their colleagues, they have an incomplete picture of what Islam has to say. We actually have nothing to offer society. So this has implications for you and I. So I really says why you talk about Islamic bioethics, because you and I, every one of us, engage in the medical care system in some form. All the time. All the time. And the fact that you take Tylenol for a headache has an empirical basis and a philosophy behind it. Or whether when you get buried, how do you do a burial? Right? So this has clear implications for all of us, because we are all discerning it. So now what happens? Move aside from the Muslim community. When you then go and you have people say, hey, Muslims talk about all this stuff, let's do our own research and look at fatwa. So we're moving from doctors to muftis. You see this paper in the Medical Academy about organ transplantation, organ donation. And they say the last sentence, you can't see it, but I'll read it to you. They did a fatwa review of Sunni fatwa. It said all 70 fatwas allow for organ donation and blood transfusion. That was the end synopsis of an academic paper. Because they say, hey, the muftis just say one word, it's all okay, it's all okay. And then what happens? Then you have National Kidney Foundation, others say, okay, look, the majority of Islamic scholars say, here's where I'm going to line this particularly because of this issue. Organ transplant is a necessity, so therefore we should be promoting it. What happens then in the Muslim community? Well, we find, after many studies, some I've done myself, that donor rates are low. They say, hey, the issue is because Muslims don't know their own scholarship, muftis have said it's okay, let's go do teachers and teach them their own religion. And produce fatwa. Let's say that organ transplantation is okay, organ donation is okay, it's mubah, and move forward. But it's all on the basis of an elementary caricature of Islam. So let me skip this slide for a second. Well, let me give you one reason to put this slide. What happens is that a Muslim physician then looks at fatwa and he says everything is a medical necessity. When you have a hammer, everything is a nail. I'm in medicine, medicine is about saving life, everything is a necessity, it's darura. And they use a term, that's a juridical term, without understanding the context of what that term means. Then you have muftis who say, look, medicine is a big thing, it helps society, has a hayat, has a nafs, right? Has a nafs, right? Everything is maslahah, it's for the benefit of society. Some elementary caricature of what medicine is all about. It's all about life-saving, let's go forth. And everything becomes a permissive fatwa. Do everything. Halal. Right? But the discourse is much more complex. Just organ donation per se. It's much more complex. And there are assumptions that need to be tested from these fatwas. There are scholars say it's impermissible to receive and give. There are people say there's certain conditions, shurut, right? So it's not a univocal tradition. And the doctors and the muftis might be reading in univocal traditions, which doesn't exist. Then we can't offer anything to society. So that's the grand view of what's happening on the ground. So here is our project that Sheikh Jihad is a part of. Right, we want to have dialogue between scholars and scientists And we brought together 6 individuals, right, from different aspects of life. So we had traditional ulama, Sheikh Amin, Sheikh Jihad, we had clinicians, myself and Dr. Hassan Rosallah, and then we had, Faisal Qazi and Hassan Rosallah, community physicians, and then you had academicians, myself and Omar Qureshi, who you may know. And we had some guest members in our working group that was funded by the Tabla Foundation. The issue was we wanted to develop a lexicon of dialogue around 2 questions. What is the soul, and how is it manifested bodily? Because we wanted to get at the metaphysics, right? Which Sheikh Jihad talked about, how metaphysics and metaphysical theory influences the way we think about neuroscience. At the same time, we want to think about risk. Medicine, maslaha, darur, it's all about risk. What are our concepts of risk in fiqh and in medicine? How can the 2 match up? And there was an intensive engagement because we have no language for dialogue. When a physician says necessity and the scholar says that means darura, there's a mismatch. So we spent time just trying to understand our vocabulary of usage in our own disciplines. Right, so the 6 retreats, over 90 hours of FaceTime, each retreat led to another sort of a retreat that we had, all of us had to present things from our own tradition. We spent time writing papers, you see academic presentations, and this is part of that. And here's one, I'm going to end now. So let me give you an example of what that leads to. That how we can recalibrate how we have something to offer society in medicine, but also ourselves. And it's about epistemology. So, let me move through this. Okay. So when we talk about certainty, and I had those 2 questions about what you're certain about, we talk about the correspondence, the idea of ilm and knowledge in Islam, right? About Julie on this thing. It's a correspondence theory. You can have certainty in yourself, that's what certainty about something, about a proposition that relates to the world around you. I'm certain this is wrong. I'm certain that this doesn't exist. The certainty aspect has a subjective pole, that's you, and an objective pole was out in the world. There's a correspondence. So you can have certainty, right, that something is true. You can have some sense of probability that something is true, and you can have probability that something is wrong. So you have this the done idea, right? It's a preponderance of probability that it's true. That it corresponds, or a done marju that it doesn't correspond. How this relates is then you can, once you understand what ilm is in Islam, and how it has to do with correspondence theory, then you can think about how can we acknowledge science in its own realm within the Islamic epistemological structure. So there are 6 areas, and this is from Mustafa Imam al-Ghazali, there are 6 areas where we believe, for all practical purposes, he lays out that you can use these ideas as having certainty in your operational sense. Al-awwaliyat are ideas about 2 things, right? It can't be this, the idea that true and false are 2 ends, right? So that's one idea of that. Look, you can't have something that's partially both. A proposition can be true or false. Or your internal sensations. I am hungry, right? You can be certain about the fact that you're hungry, and you can make that claim. You don't need anything else, anybody else, to adjudicate that matter. But here's where science comes in. Empirical observations, right? So by my touching something, right, this is solid. And I as an individual can make that claim. But I can also make by induction general claims. Fire burns, right? Fire burns is a general claim. Not that this fire is burning, but fire burns. And you can be certain about that. You can be certain about that within Islamic tradition. So what we have today, people say science is always immutable and changing, don't believe anything about that. But this is not from our tradition. This is not how we operationalize in fiqh. And it's very important to understand where this comes from. Then when I talk about hadith, we have this idea that how does hadith come in? How does hadith say come in? Because we believe mutawatir exist. That people won't hear, you won't say that fitna didn't occur in Baltimore. For all of you to say that, right? For all of you to say that, you have to come together and make some sort of, we're going to lie all together. All of you are going to do that together. So this has implications for both dini knowledge and worldly knowledge. So when all specialists around the world, right, all specialists, 150 say that look, Zika is bad, you shouldn't have Olympics here. There's something, unless they're all colluding together to say that this exists. All right, so now how does this implications? The last slide, last 2 slides. So a simple question about medicine: when should we seek medical treatment? Becomes an exercise not in just coming with a fatwa, but understanding where do you draw upon certainty in science, that's the question, as well as within fiqh. And what you find is that in our tradition we have at least 2 authenticated reports from Rasulullah that we are certain about from Mutlaq, right? And one, he says that there are people who will enter Jannah, right, who will never have allowed themselves to be treated by cauterization and other conditions here, and they will enter Jannah. the idea of leaving off at that time quarter years of treatment, leaving off medical treatment leads to a high reward. At the same time, you have a report that says, seek medical treatment for Allah's created, right? You know this, Allah has not created illness that has a cure. So you resolve a tension between two authenticated reports that you're certain about by looking at science. That's what jurists did. So they said, hey, there's this idea of having tawakkul, which is a virtue from Rasulullah. So not all medicine seeking is always obligatory. Yet we know that there's a command that he says that you should seek medical treatment. But what is medicine about? So here, so this is what the traditional school source said about seeking medical treatment. That it almost never, right, that in the general state, the hukum, that's permissible, right, by the three schools you see here, and one says it's actually recommended. But the detail here at the last column here is that they posit this on the effectiveness of treatment. That medical science has to be certain about the treatment they're offering. Or the individual himself has to be certain. So you take that Tylenol, are you certain about that Tylenol removing your headache? Then we can maybe make this an obligation upon you for some reasons. But if the science is not certain, and you're not certain, then perhaps it just never becomes an obligation. Why is that important? Then you're not sinful for leaving it. Right? And when we talk about medicine, each one of the things that a doctor recommends has some basis upon it. So we've seen it in the literature, right? In medical literature, you do studies about it. You have to make a claim. So this is too in-depth for this moment. But my point is, the Islamic juridical tradition takes all this idea about certainty and epistemology within medicine, and then says, hey, let's look at that discipline itself, what they say about their own treatments, and then incorporate it into fiqh. But take it at their value, how people within the discipline adjudicate their own certainty. So here, I want to stop this. Here's my recommendation, right, for this idea here. That epidemiological science, right, can be and will be incorporated within our fiqh tradition. When you read fatwa that have no idea about what medicine is about, and they say cure and disease, you know that they don't understand what medicine is. And when you have Muslim doctors saying it's all about darura, they don't understand what Islamic law is. And what we need to do is bridge those people together. And our working group trying to have this conversation by just looking at one issue, and that was about epistemology, and that has further ramifications for everything that we do. So let me now let Sheikh Bilal talk about another way that they brought science to us.
Excellent, thank you so much. Jihad has been telling me that I'm putting product placements here, so I'll put a few more. So, because they are relevant to what Dr. Aasim was talking about. One is a IIIT book on ethics of reproductive health, and the other is a book on epistemological integration, both of which are very relevant to what he was talking about. And Dr. Aasim is going to be a IIIT research fellow with us from early September, inshallah, till early December, about 3 months. So we're going to continue this conversation with him. So Sheikh Bilal, I was told that you're going to speak less than the two, not combined, but each one of them. So I was told that.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلوات وأتم التسليمات على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وأصحابه آمين. So, Sheikh Jihad's speech, I think, should have allowed us to appreciate the afati discussions, and then I think Dr. Aasim's discussion brought us to the anfus, more to the practical level. I'm going to stay at the anfus level of discussion of actually a case study of the nafs here, or mental health in particular, and try to give you an idea of how in one particular initiative or project called the Khalil Center, there was a certain degree of collaboration between Islamic theologians or ulama and mental health practitioners, and how that plays out and some of the challenges that were faced in this project. So I obviously have to give you some background. This is a lot of technical information. I may speed through some of this information, but just to give you a short history. So about 4 years ago, a clinical psychologist came for graduate studies here to Chicago, actually. And because of his background in Islamic spirituality, recognized that there was a need for him to sort of integrate his understanding of the rich tradition of Islamic spirituality with his practice and his training. At the same time, I considered myself a counselor by compulsion. I used to go once a week to the local mental health facility. It's more like a correctional facility, a prison. And I was near the seminary of madrasa where I was teaching. And once a week I would interact with some of the patients there and recognize the need, and I hope appreciate the need for more knowledge in the field of mental health. Because oftentimes I'd be there to teach Arabic, but then I'd be confronted with questions of the mental health of the particular patient. And so this was by chance, of course, the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that myself and the founder of the center, Uman Kishivarzi, were able to interact. And because of his appreciation for the rich Islamic tradition and my appreciation of my ignorance, I think we were able to begin to discuss in the form of a platform, in the form of a spiritual wellness center, create an institution that will allow us to have some further discussions. And I think the need for a mental health center, a Muslim mental health center, that was able to provide care that was culturally sensitive, religiously sensitive, and was able to target its services and its education and its research towards the Muslim community was quite obvious. And yet, when we did a short and a brief review of the landscape, we discovered, just like in the field of research in Muslim mental health, there was very little that we could use as sort of a paradigm. We had nothing to navigate, really. It was almost the absence of something that we could use it as a platform where we would find some degree of integration between Islamic theologians and their thought and the rich tradition of actually Muslim mental health that we would discover later, and then also, contemporary philosophies of psychology. So these are obviously some statistics you can look through, and I think most people personally will know someone, maybe in their family or in their community, who suffers from a mental health illness. The challenge that we faced was that here, on one hand, we have a clinical psychologist who's now pursuing his PhD and trying to understand and focus on a particular subfield of Muslim psychology or forensic psychiatry, which is the overlap of law and psychology. So while he was studying forensic psychiatry, he was beginning to appreciate the need to study in depth Islamic spirituality and see how behavioral therapy in the history of Islamic spirituality can contribute to the discourse of modern Islamic psychology. So this was actually something we didn't think would be much appreciated, and yet the influx of clients made us realize more and more day by day that there was a huge need for culturally and religiously sensitive psychological treatment. Now, you might have noticed that we don't call the Khalil Center a clinic. We call it a community wellness center or a spiritual wellness center. And that was because of the concerns of Muslim quote-unquote clients. Most clients are concerned about their mental health and their spiritual health, and yet have a difficulty navigating between the two. What is something that may be clinically diagnosable as a mental illness, and what is simply just an issue of a lack of tawakkul or yaqeen. So there were a number of reasons why people hesitated to go to a conventional psychologist for treatment or a psychiatrist. And so we addressed some of these concerns. And what's really unique about the initial board that was established by Khalil Center was that it was, we hope, a manifestation of a desire of practitioners as well as ulama, theologians, to create that discourse which Dr. Aasim presented so nicely in that slide. So, like, for example, on our board consists of psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, neurologists, as well as ulama with backgrounds in applied behavioral sciences and also in other various sciences. So on the one hand, you have an appreciation, and I think this is the first point I want to emphasize. I have a very limited amount of time. On the one hand, you have an appreciation, and then on the other hand, you need a certain degree of expertise. Without these two elements, I think it's almost impossible to allow such a collaborative project to succeed. And part of that appreciation was criticizing the conventional understandings in the field. So in the field, actually, in mental health, we realize that there's actually a lot of this critical review of conventional psychology. And they have come up with a lot of terms, oftentimes very highly technical and difficult to understand. So there's this biopsycho-socio-spiritual approach now to mental health. Right? The psycho-spiritual approach, which also incorporates like the jism and like physical health, and also incorporates intellectual growth. So we call this the biopsycho-socio-spiritual approach, but it's really just a more holistic approach to the human ontology. These statistics, I'm just going to run through them. What I want to get to is actually what challenges we're facing now. Now, Sheikh Jihad mentioned so eloquently and articulately that there needs to be an ability to navigate the paradigms, the scientific paradigms of the time. And if one was to identify some of the main critique of science, modern science, perhaps at the forefront of those philosophical problems is reductionist empiricism. And the question is, how do we as mental health specialists, practitioners, not myself, but others, deal with that in their daily, providing of services? And so, if you look at the type of services we provide, we have prevention, intervention, wellness, and then we also have the question of education and research. So one of the challenges, the first challenges that we faced was that we have this huge limitation of resources, human resources and financial resources. But we want to, before we focus too much of our attention on providing services, be also able to educate and research, create models, create standards of practice, right? Answer the very basic questions like, in Islamic law, is it permissible to involuntarily hospitalize someone? And how does that relate to the problem in modern science of institutionalization, the mechanization of science, and how it creates this sort of a tendency, this assumption that everybody should be institutionalized if they have a mental health issue. How many issues are people dealing with which are really not clinical, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, doesn't even deal with until it becomes a clinical issue? Where does, for example, the masjid and the normal social experiences of a Muslim help with issues of depression, for example? So a lot of this research needs to be done. We were recently doing research on the Ottoman mental health system. And it was interesting because in our literature review at Forensic Psychiatry, we found that there were very frequently assumptions made that Islamic history doesn't have anything to contribute to the field of mental health, the issue of expert witnesses, right? And I was very hesitant when I saw this. I don't have a background in history, or in the history of mental health, but it just didn't seem right. And when I traveled to Turkey recently, I asked some Ottoman historians that, are you aware of a history of mental health practices? And they said yes, and there's actually a very famous museum which used to be a mental hospital attached to the medical college, which was attached to also the hospital. So we have evidence, and it's very interesting if you look at the nature and the architecture of that particular building. But it was a very integrated system. So we know that system may have existed, and of course science has updated itself, but there was a philosophy that guided mental health practice in the recent past. So I think I'm done with 2 minutes, okay? So now we have this challenge that how do we devote resources to the research and education portion of Khalil Center while also being able to survive by providing services. And so there was a suggestion by one of the advisors that you need to create a system which focuses heavily on service, right, and providing services so that you can simply function as an institution. Otherwise, financially, you're just going to go, downwards. So, we started to provide services like web therapy. We're actually the only tele-mental health provider in the Muslim community. We also provide face-to-face therapy, counseling, consultation, coaching, psychotherapy groups, cognitive testing, and then also Sharia consultation, which is really interesting. So we just started this recently, that we have a lot of clients who come and they're seeking a very simple legal solution to their problem. And so the therapist will come to the advisors on the board and will ask them that, for this particular issue of this mental issue, what's the legal ruling on the issue? And so we'll give the therapist the solution. The therapist will give that solution to the therapist. The therapist will insist, no, I want to hear from the imam. Right? So we have like 2 hours or 4 hours a week now that we're going to be committing to providing the therapist as well as clients an opportunity to sit with a Sharia consultant. Right? So these are services. But the bigger problem is, this is the beneficiaries, that we want to educate our therapists as well as the scholars who are involved in providing Sharia consultation, basic training. So we have like Imam intake training, where we provide imams some basic training as to how to receive a client and recognize what is something they can probably deal with through behavioral therapy and what they should refer to a professional. And we have imam convenings, where we have conferences where we present some research and statistics to the imams and allow them to appreciate some of the problems, the mental health problems that exist in the community. And at the same time, we have therapist internship training, where we deal with some of these issues, critical views of science and modern mental health. So I'm going to wrap up with this because we had to go through this, but just to sum up, some of these challenges, I think the only resolution is advanced learning, both from the perspective of the practitioner as well as the ulama and the theologians, and providing platforms for further study. Continuing education is a very important problem, and as Sheikh Jihad once said to me, with the dissolution of the endowment system, we have like a responsibility to build those platforms again, to allow this collaborative work to continue and to succeed, and to provide standards of practice and solutions that will, inshallah ta'ala, be implemented on a global level. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq.
Sheikh Bilal, these are very important issues, and Sheikh Jihad is pointing to another product placement, which I have to put here. We have a book also published by IIIT. It's a translation of the 9th century manuscript, part of that manuscript actually, by Abu Zayd al-Balkhi on Masalih al-Adnan wal-Anfus. Actually, so I will loosely translate that as well-being of body and soul. Yeah, good pass. So the part that is translated to English is Masalih al-Anfus, about what is soul related. And so it's a short book, check it out, IIIT publication, really, really insightful. But before, we won't have much time, so we'll take probably about 3 questions only, and I'll just give each panelist the opportunity to address any or all 3 of those questions. But before that, I just want to make a few announcements that ICNA wants us to make when we moderate these sessions. And first of all is that please like ICNA on social media and do the same with IIIT. We have a website, IIIT.org as well. Go to the ICNA Convention website and give a feedback to ICNA. They would like to know how we can improve the experience, as well as next year's convention is going to be in April as opposed to in May because of Ramadan. And you can also check other messages by downloading ICNA's app, which can also give you a full schedule and program and bios of all the speakers. So let us take 3 questions and then I'll ask each panelist to address them. So Dr. Jasir, and then Brother. Yes.
So I really appreciate the work that Dr. Aasim and Sheikh Bilal, Sheikh Jihad are doing. And as somebody who's involved in fatwa, the number of capacities and Shia and Islamic and fiqh, I think that's the kind of committee that you can ask for fatwa when it comes to medical issues. As an insider, not an outsider of few majami' fiqhiyya, it is not enough to bring a doctor to give the mashayikh a presentation for an hour or 2, for the mashayikh really to make the right fatwa. Dr. Aasim mentioned organ transplantation. I had a couple of students who wrote theses under my supervision, and they took at the end of the thesis the opposite view of the publicized view that this is something that is mubah, because they found lots of harms when they get into the real issue, the real medical issue. Lots of harms of transplantation, let alone just an open market for donation and question. So the question is, how can we contact you to help us, inshallah, with the 50 research that we can do?
Okay, so we can do that. Yes,
my understanding is that maybe it's the European Fiqh Council that actually has physicians authoring the fatwa. are co-authoring.
So maybe this is the conversation you can have afterward. Let's just take questions with.
Question is this.
Salam.
Quran says, "Allazina amanu tatma'innu qulubuhum bi dhikrillah, ala bi dhikrillah tatma'innu qulub." Those who are believers, if you remember from that God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the problem of the heart will be easily removed from the dhikrullah ta'ala. I see, I travel to most of the Muslim countries, especially in Saudi Arabia. I work in the hospital. I see there are very less people in the mental problem, those who are Muslim believers. Also Bangladesh, Pakistan, most of the Muslim majority countries.
They're all in the masajid in North America.
You know, the believers, they console. They have some mental consolation by dhikrullah.
Quick comment, because they don't have
So
much time.
in this respect,
Question.
what is the importance of the believers dhikr in the Taqdeer? With the modern world, other countries, I want a conclusion of this point.
Okay, thank you so much. And one more question we'll take. Over here. Yes.
Get closer.
Yeah, here, right. With the microphone.
So my question is, I'm assuming that there's this large gap between the physicians and Islamic thought on medicine and other fields in America because there's a lack of infrastructure already built. But do you find it a similar case in Muslim countries and other parts of the world that there's this lack of dialogue as well?
Okay, so we'll leave the microphone back now, and we'll just go in the order of appearance.
So I'm just going to, Bismillah, I want to three and turn it over to Sheikh Jihad Brown. So Dr. Jasser, for giving you du'as, you keep on doing this work. You know, the program that leads Additional Islamic Medicine at the University of Chicago, we don't have all the answers to everything, but the point is we want to bring people together to deliver those answers. As the second person mentioned, there is a lack of infrastructure, there's a lack of lexicon, there's a lack of sustainability within these sorts of dialogues because they're like one-off sort of band-aid solutions, right? So we spent 3 years in dialogue to just talk about certainty, right? And if I said I need 10 years to talk about organ transplantation, I don't know if the community would sustain that, and we don't have infrastructures and institutes that want to be in the long term for that. So I think that Maulana Bilal, as he's speaking about, we're trying to be a place where we can start to have a dialogue and then develop individuals who can have feet in both worlds and address the challenges today. So you can look up my stuff in Chicago, but I agree with you, there are other institutes like this, other places similar, but don't have the long-term sort of buy-in. I think that the second sort of question about dhikr, I'm going to let Maulana Bilal talk about that, but I just want us to be cautious. So my program is trying to be data-driven and theory-based. A lot of us have these elementary caricatures that things don't exist in our community because we don't collect data, one. Two, because we oversimplify the notions of what Quran tells us, right? So even in there, my experience, right? So doctors don't do this, or people don't have issues with mental health, they just read more Quran. And I just caution us from being so elementary with our tradition. There are many hadith, a lot of things that Rasulullah faced in his life, and people gave advice that some might say that were actually mental health problems. It's not that it didn't exist or doesn't exist in Puritan societies. And the third point, I think that as you mentioned here with your question, you know, I will tell you that in the Muslim world we have, just like here, we have people who have challenges of understanding in both worlds. In the Muslim world, by and large, we don't produce knowledge, both in the seminary and the academy. We're consumers and technicians and technocrats, right? And we have very little into R&D anywhere, except for R&D for new iPhones in Pakistan or something. So I think that we should not have this glamour view that, you know, somewhere in the Muslim world solutions exist. My own limited decade plus in this area, I find they struggle with the same things that we do. And our global ummah is struggling with trying to catch up in many ways from our own tradition, in the seminary tradition, as well as in the academic scientific tradition. So that's my only comments. We can talk after over here. All of us have a flight after this, so we can indulge you for a little while and want to leave. So Sheikh Jihad,
So maybe Maulana Bilal can speak more to the dynamics of the dhikr aspect that our esteemed uncle was speaking about. You're going to have aspects of mental health in a society where you have the best case scenario. Someone who is engaged in a deep dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with understanding, with an immersion type of dhikr, is going to be inoculated against certain anxieties that you may not find in other societies, right? And we'll let Sayyid Bilal go into that in more depth, but in that comparison on mental health from this society to the other, I think one interesting note is the issue of institutionalization, which Maulana brought up. If you look at a traditional society, what do you see? Any people who have lived for long periods of time in a traditional Muslim society, right? What is the one? There are very few mental health institutions. We're not institutionalizing people. The people actually live amongst us. They naturally gravitate toward the masajid as well. And you can see that, for example, in the city of Damascus. And the sort of socialization of mental health difficulties, and we're talking about clinical difficulties, is more robust, more humane than you might find in certain industrialized countries that want to put these people out of sight and out of mind. Whereas in the city of Damascus, right, we live with these people, we're gentle with those people, they remind us of gentleness and the need for that, they gravitate toward the masajid because in theory, the masajid is where you'll find more gentle people. And in a city like Damascus, you do find it to be that way. Hasn't been my experience in other countries, however. So there's that point on institutionalization. And then someone asked if the same conflict exists where there is cross-disciplinary communication between scholars of Sharia sciences and health practitioners. I would say that in the Muslim world, I would say it depends on the society that we're talking about. It depends on the country. There are certain countries that are knowledge societies, right? My experience is with the city of Damascus, where you have a very, very high level of knowledge, practice, and a very, very deep level of acumen in the application of Sharia instruments and methodologies. And then there is also a natural relationship between physicians and scholars. They're constantly communicating with one another. They're constantly sharing because there are structures set up in that society that enable frequent meeting, frequent sharing, right? At the same time, a lot of physicians are also students of knowledge in the city of Damascus. Some of them have, through part-time study in the evenings, become effectively scholars in their own right. And I've seen people on a trajectory when I first met them in 1994, and I go back to visit Damascus, Allahumma farrij anha, right? That they are extremely accomplished after spending suhbah, long periods of time with great scholars. And then you have examples like Mufti Abu Yusra Abedin, who was one of the most well-known and accomplished scholars, who was Mufti of Syria in the 1960s, was also a practicing physician, right? And one of the greatest resources of Hashiyat ibn Abedin in the city. So most specialists in Hashiyat ibn Abedin are getting that from Abu Yusra Abedin, who was also a practicing physician. So where there is deep scholarship going on, where people are drinking deep from the well of Islamic Sharia disciplines, you will find that there's a lot of amenability, there's a lot of people working and understanding the dynamics of what's going on together. When you have places that are essentially knowledge deserts, or they have adopted a version of Islam that is one-dimensional and more sort of heavy-handed, or a cookie-cutter approach, or more ideological, right? You'll find that there are these rifts and difficulties.
So I think that those two answers were quite sufficient. Maybe to add, you know, our Islamic tradition does differentiate between various types of mental illnesses. You know, so Junoon, for example, our paper was on forensic psychiatry. Quran Hadith, you know, gives us understanding about taklif, the idea of responsibility, who's responsible, who's not responsible. So if you were to, you know, oversimplify and give dhikr as a recommendation to a person who's majnoon and mukallaf as a form of remedy for insanity, then, you know, obviously I think that would be oversimplification, not appreciation for how you say that demarcation. The second thing I think is that dhikr also people don't recognize the complexity of our dhikr tradition as well. And our Islamic spiritual tradition is very robust. And you know, the method of prescribing dhikr to different individuals so that it can become into that you know, piece of heart. I think there's a need for an appreciation of that rich tradition so that we can also utilize those methodologies or methods or practices appropriately for various different situations.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you who came here today. It's very obvious that there is a great need and desire to learn about these things. So what I would like to recommend, especially among those here who are young and still have the ability and choices to make in terms of studying and what you're going to study in colleges and universities, is to keep these issues in mind and see how you can, within your own discipline, within your own specialization, during the course of your own studies, acquire the kind of knowledge and combine it in a way that will help many, you know, bring about many of the answers that we need today to understand the rich tradition that we have in Islam, and then how that combines with modern scientific knowledge and how we can create something that will make, again, our tradition the leading tradition that will produce, again, the culture and civilization that we are still proud about 10, 12 centuries later. Imagine how much more proud we would be if it actually was actualized today. So Jazakumullah khairan. Please don't forget to visit the IIIT book display here, and also the larger one at the bazaar, the booths 312 and 314, as well as the IIIT's educational division, the Fairfax Institute, which also has its own booth over there at the bazaar. And once again, thank you all so much for coming. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.